Hello, this is Jaki Ferenz with Avalon Risk Management, your premier provider of insurance and surety solutions for the transportation industry. In our last episode, Michael Brown covered the liability that those who hire motor carriers can incur for death, bodily injury, and damage to third-party property. In this episode, I will discuss the importance of having a formal carrier selection process and how this can mitigate your risk when choosing carriers. Due to the amount of material we'll be covering, this topic will be broken into two parts. This episode will focus primarily on the framework of the process and the use of data that can be accessed publicly from the FMCSA. Every company that hires motor carriers should have a set of formal carrier selection procedures that employees must follow. These procedures should be in writing, and adherence to them should be mandatory. Procedures that are inconsistently followed can lead to problems if and when you're involved in litigation. Before I discuss the possible components of a carrier selection process, I want to be sure to clarify that this episode is not intended to provide you with a checklist of procedures to include in your own process. Exactly what goes into your own process is a personal choice and should be discussed with your transportation attorney. The goal of this episode is to familiarize you with some of the components that other transportation brokers and domestic surface freight forwarders have included in their carrier selection process. First, it's important to make sure that any motor carrier that you select has valid operating authority from FMCSA. In our last episode, you heard about the Linhart versus Hale case, where a transportation broker selected a carrier that had their operating authority revoked by FMCSA. The carrier was involved in an accident, and the result was a judgment against the broker in excess of $5 million. You can verify that a carrier has both a DOT and MC number and active operating authority on FMCSA's website for no charge. In Episode 6, Kathy Schricker discussed the FMCSA's new unified registration system. Please note that as this is rolled out over the next several years, the identification numbers that carriers have will change. For the time being, however, carriers will have both a DOT and MC number. A carrier safety rating can also be checked online at no charge by going to www.safersys.org. Just click on Company Snapshot from the homepage. Not all motor carriers will have a safety rating, but those that do will be shown as either satisfactory, conditional, or unsatisfactory. Most brokers will not select carriers with unsatisfactory rating. Many will avoid carriers with a conditional rating as well. It should be noted that the safer data is not always accurate. If a carrier tells you that their rating is incorrect, you can verify this by contacting the FMCSA. In 2010, the FMCSA rolled out its Compliance, Safety, Accountability, or CSA framework. This incorporated a safety measurement system, or SMS, wherein carriers are assigned basic scores and compared with their peer group in categories like unsafe driving, hours of service compliance, driver fitness, controlled substance or alcohol fractions, and vehicle maintenance. By making this data publicly available, the government hopes that the FMCSA's enforcement capabilities can be supplemented by the private sector. They reason that the public's reticence to use carriers with worse than average basic scores will pressure these operators to improve. In doing so, unfortunately, the FMCSA is necessarily forcing those who consider SMS basics as part of their selection procedure to make judgment calls that should really be made by safety experts. Should a carrier be disqualified if they have an alert on one basic but excellent scores on the rest? What about 2 alerts? What about 3? If you decide that carriers with a fatigue driving basic score of 70 or more will be disqualified, should you really have selected the carrier with a score of 69? These are difficult, if not impossible, questions to answer. To add to all this, several independent studies have drawn into question the correlation between the basic scores and the actual accident risk posed by a carrier. Finally, it's worth noting that many carriers do not yet have basic scores. While some brokers consider basic scores as part of their carrier selection process, others have chosen not to. The latter believe that they assume additional risk by reviewing the data and drawing an arbitrary line between acceptable and unacceptable carriers based on CSA data. They contend that it is the government's responsibility to shut down carriers that their experts deem unsafe. Whether you use CSA data in your carrier selection process is a choice that you need to make after careful consideration with your transportation attorney. Today we discussed ways that one could approach the development of their own framework for selecting carriers and the use of data that can be accessed publicly from the FMCSA. In our next episode, we will continue our discussion on the topic of the carrier selection process, focusing on the insurance and documentation aspects. Thanks for watching.